In 1513, Niccolo Machiavelli wrote The Prince, a brutal, honest assessment of political power that scandalized Europe for centuries. In 1983, Michael Saylor, then an MIT graduate student, wrote a dissertation asking, what if we could model Machiavelli's insights mathematically? What if political power, class conflict, and economic systems could be analyzed with the same rigor we use for engineering or physics? The result was a Machiavellian approach to economics, and it's unlike anything you've probably encountered in economics or political science. This is the first video in a series where we'll work through Saylor's entire model, equation by equation, system by system. By the end, you'll understand how political economies actually work, not through ideology, but through systems dynamics. I'm Brian, and I teach mathematics, particularly the mathematics of systems that most people think can't be mathematized. Bitcoin cryptography, financial instruments, and yes, political economy. This series is based on a course I've built around Michael Saylor's MIT dissertation. Now, you might know Saylor as the CEO of MicroStrategy or as Bitcoin's most prominent corporate advocate. But before all that, he was a systems theorist trying to understand how power and economics actually interact. Here's what makes this dissertation fascinating. Saylor doesn't approach politics through ideology, left, right, libertarian, socialist, whatever. Instead, he asks, what are the fundamental dynamics? What feedback loops exist? Where are the equilibrium points? Where are the breaking points? And he uses Machiavelli as his foundation, not because Machiavelli was right morally, but because Machiavelli was honest about how power actually operates. Let's start with the problem Machiavelli was trying to solve. It's Florence, early 1500s. Machiavelli has spent years as a diplomat and political advisor. He's watched republics collapse, princes rise and fall, alliances form and shatter. He's seen what actually works versus what people say should work. Most political philosophers at the time, and honestly, most today, write about how things ought to be. Here's how a just ruler should behave. Here's how citizens should act. Here's the ideal state. Machiavelli does something different. He asks, how do things actually work? What do successful rulers actually do? When do states actually collapse? This is descriptive analysis, not prescriptive philosophy, and it's brutal in its honesty. Machiavelli observes that people are generally self-interested. Power concentrates unless actively prevented. Social norms constrain behavior, but only to a point. Circumstances, fortuna, matter as much as virtue. Systems can be stable, oscillating, or collapsing. Now, here's the key insight that Saylor picks up on. These aren't just observations. They're the building blocks of a system. A system, in the technical sense, is a set of components that interact over time through feedback loops. Think about a thermostat. The room temperature affects whether the heater turns on. The heater affects the room temperature. That's a negative feedback loop. It stabilizes the system around a target temperature. Or think about a bank run. Fear that the bank might fail causes withdrawals. Withdrawals make the bank more likely to fail. That's a positive feedback loop. It destabilizes the system. Now, what Saylor realized is that Machiavelli's observations describe a political economy as a system with multiple feedback loops. Class conflict affects legislation. Legislation affects wealth distribution. Wealth distribution affects class conflict. Executive power affects social stability. Social stability affects executive power. Production affects everything. Everything affects production. This isn't just philosophy anymore. This is something we can model mathematically. We can simulate it. We can ask, what happens if we change this parameter? What happens under these initial conditions? This is where we're headed. Don't worry, we'll build up to this piece by piece. But I want you to see what Saylor created. a formal model of Machiavellian political economy. You might be wondering, why study a 40-year-old dissertation about a 500-year-old philosopher? 3 reasons. First, systems thinking is more relevant than ever. We live in a world of complex feedback loops, social media algorithms, financial markets, supply chains, pandemics. Understanding how systems behave helps you understand what's actually happening versus what people tell you is happening. Second, political economy still works this way. Class conflict still exists. Executives still accumulate and use power. Production shocks still destabilize societies. The specifics change. We're not worried about Florentine republics anymore, but the dynamics persist. Third, this approach moves you from borrowed belief to earned conviction. Instead of accepting someone's ideology about how economics or politics works, you'll understand the underlying system. You'll be able to reason through scenarios yourself. You'll spot feedback loops. You'll see where systems are stable and where they're fragile. And honestly, this connects directly to why many of you might be interested in Bitcoin and decentralized systems. Bitcoin is fundamentally about changing the feedback loops in monetary and political systems. Understanding Machiavellian systems dynamics helps you understand why decentralization matters and how it changes the game. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Here's how this series will unfold. Module 1, Where We Are Now, establishes the foundation. We'll cover political philosophy, the basics of system dynamics, and how Saylor brings them together. Module 2 explores Machiavelli's conception of the state in detail. What assumptions did he make? What did he observe? How does Saylor formalize this? Module 3 is where we dive into the model itself. We'll go through each sector: class conflict, legislation, executive power, economic production, resistance, and rebellion. We'll see the equations, run simulations, and understand the dynamics. Module 4 examines what the model tells us. What does equilibrium look like? What happens when executives act? How do production shocks ripple through the system? When does corruption lead to collapse? Module 5 synthesizes everything and asks, what does this teach us about political economies in general? How do we apply this today? Each video will be structured like this. Clear conceptual explanation first. Visual demonstrations. Mathematical formalization where appropriate. Historical and modern examples. Challenge problems to test your understanding. The course website has interactive elements you can explore alongside these videos. I'll link to specific lessons in each video description. In the next video, we'll start with the early political philosophers who influenced Machiavelli: Plato, Aristotle, Polybius. We need to understand what Machiavelli was reacting against and building upon. Then, we'll trace how political philosophy evolved into system theory, from Machiavelli's prose observations to formal mathematical models. Before the next video, I want you to think about this question. What feedback loops do you see in your own political and economic system? Where does wealth concentration create more wealth concentration? Where does power create more power? Where are the stabilizing forces? Where are the destabilizing forces? Start training yourself to see systems, not just events. If you want to dive deeper right now, check out the full interactive course at the link in the description. If you find this series valuable, consider supporting it through the Bitcoin Lightning address or Patreon link below. And if you have questions or insights, drop them in the comments. I read everyone, and your questions often shape future videos. Next time, the philosophers who set the stage for Machiavelli's revolution. See you then.